Hello, today we're going to talk about indirect speech part 2. The aims of this presentation are the following. First, we're going to teach students how to report questions. Two types, yes or no questions and WH questions. We are also going to have a look at imperatives, and then we're going to practice some of the theory with practical exercises. Now let's begin by having a look at indirect speech yes or no questions. Use if, whether or not to form indirect yes or no questions. Let's have a look at the example on the screen. Are you going to feed the animals right now? Mary asked. In this case, we have a yes or no question because the answer is a yes or no. So, if we want to transform this into indirect reported speech, this is the resulting clause. Mary asked if or whether I was going to feed the animals at that moment. Remember that you have to make the necessary changes in the verb tense as well as in the place and time expressions or personal possessive pronouns. Now let's have a look at the other case, WH questions. You have to use question forms to form indirect WH questions. Questions forms are words such as who, when, which, what, how, and why. Let's have a look at the example on the screen. Which fertilizer did you use last week? Mary asked. In this case, this sentence uses a WH word, which is which. So, if we transform this into indirect speech, this is the result. Mary asked which fertilizer I had used the previous week, the week before. So as you can see, we use the WH word, which, and then we have to make the necessary changes in the verb tenses as well as in the pronouns and the place or time expressions. So, use is changed into I, the verb use, which is in the past simple, becomes had used, past perfect, and then last week becomes the previous week, the week before. Okay, remember, in indirect questions, the subject also comes before the verb as in statements. This means that a reported question is no longer a question. So, do not use do, thus, or did. In indirect questions, we often end in a full point, and they never end with a question mark. And finally, remember to make the necessary changes in the verb tenses as well as in the pronouns or place-time expressions. Now let's have a look at the imperatives. Imperatives in direct speech use the base form of the verb. For example, eat your soup. In indirect speech, imperatives use the infinitive to report one of the following cases: instructions, commands, requests, or invitations. Now let's have a look at the formation of imperatives. We normally use to plus the base of the verb to report an imperative in the affirmative, and we use not to plus the base of the verb for a negative one. Let's have a look at the example on the screen. Plow your fields more often, he recommended. In this case, we have an affirmative imperative, plow. So, he recommended to plow my fields more often. Here we have to plow. Now let's have a look at an imperative in the negative. Don't use so much compost in your yard, he advised me. And the sentence would be, he advised me not to use so much compost in my yard. Now let's have a look at some practice. In this exercise, you have to rewrite the following statements as indirect speech. So first you have to identify whether the statements are questions, yes or no, or WH questions, or imperatives. And then remember to make all the necessary changes. Let's have a look at the first one. Why should we protect species such as the Iberian lynx? The forester asked. In this case, we have a WH question with why. So, here comes the key. the forester asked why we should protect species such as the Iberian lynx. We have changed the verb tense as well. Should protect remains the same, should protect, because this was one of the cases where it wasn't necessary to change the verb. Let's have a look at the next one. Are you going to harvest the oranges earlier this year? She asked me. Here we have to make a change in the verb, and we also have a time expression, this year. So here comes the key. She asked me if or whether I was going to harvest the oranges earlier that year. In this case, we had in the direct speech, this is a yes or no question. So we need to use if or whether to report this question. Then we also make necessary changes in the subject, you becomes I, and in the verb, going to harvest was going to harvest. Let's have a look at the next one. Who is taking the cow to the vet tomorrow? They wanted to know. In this case, we have a WH question with who. We also have a verb tense and a time expression. So here comes the key. They wanted to know who was taking the cow to the vet the next day. So as you can see, we need the WH word, who. We make the necessary change in the verb, is taken, was taken, and then we change tomorrow for the next day. Let's have a look at number 4. Separate litter in your own house if you want to be environmentally green, she advised me. Here we have two different types of sentences. In the first part we have an imperative in the affirmative, separate litter, and then we have just a statement, if you want to be environmentally green. So these are the changes we have to make. He advised me to separate litter in my own house if I wanted to be environmentally green. So here the imperative, separate, is introduced by to plus the base form of the verb, to separate. And then we make the necessary change from want to be into the past, wanted to be. And let's have a look at the last one. Don't leave the lights on if you want to save energy, she recommended. Here we have an imperative in the negative, don't leave. So the transformation would be as follows. She recommended not to leave the lights on if I wanted to save energy. So remember that the negative imperative is reported with not to leave. And then we have the second part, which is just a statement, if you want, into the past, if I wanted to save energy, with the necessary change in the pronoun as well. And this is all for today. Thank you very much.